lecture series on English literature, methods, and it's not a long time otherwise. Remember, I think what we have discussed so far is about like we are discussing the now the entire history of English literature, covering the two prominent ages particularly. Uh, if you have remembered so far, we have talked about in the previous lecture series. We have talked about that I have covered so far is about the literary criticism and various theories that have been evolved so far, right? And what I have been told is that you guys have been completed with the topic that what you have discussed so far is about the period that is till 16th century, right? 16th to 17th century. And now in this lecture series, we are going to start with particularly the age of sensibility, right? So keeping these net and state for the subject English, we are going to have exactly we are going to brief history, and I think till now we have discussed this exactly so far till the 16th century English literature, various periods that have taken so far, exactly the contribution of prominent figures in English literary criticism, the English literature, exactly the political, social, and cultural status that literally has influenced the literature that were produced in various periods so far. Right. Before we commence with in our today's session with the age of sensibility, particularly with around 40 or we can say till 1998 or something. Exactly the period that covers the span. Prior to that, when we try to focus or understand exactly what happened before that, is definitely exactly before this age of sensibility. This got the very interesting part, that is the age, exactly, which is can consider the age of hope, or also considered as the Augustan period, exactly, where prominent figures like Alexander Pope, John Dryden, exactly, and few of the other prominent Flair were there, exactly. Prominent figures were there which have greatly contributed in the period, very much period, right? So coming and focusing on those very elements of this literature particularly, it is much more important to have a kind of a clear sensation about those prominent figures and what kind of contribution they have made so far, how literature got shaped particularly. Now, as I tell you then, it is much more important to have a look at the particular period. Exactly. Now, before we commence with that, it is kind of like a hammering you people will find right now when I'm starting discussing about those very interesting factors. That when it comes to prepare for this net set examination, people, I think it is much more of an importance to have this very interesting outlook within us. That the kind of approach we have when we deal with those subjects. Exactly. The various concepts that we come across while we are studying for the net set examination, people. The very important factor that matters the most is that having a kind of a particular systematic, the particular and systematic way of looking at those various topics, their importance, and the nature of questions that are asked in those examinations particularly. Now, looking at the nature particularly, or the very habitual method of net set examination and the questions that are asked in those exams, is that their style of changing, exactly the way they are formed, their style of how they are formed in every pattern, they are getting changed, exactly. The style of asking those questions get changed every year. Now, keeping this very particular method, but the syllabus remains the same, the content remains the same, their style of asking is changing, but definitely the content is same. Now, focusing more on content, what matters the most is the revision and our way of comprehending those various terminologies, concepts, ideas, thoughts, styles of writers, the period, the kind of a genre that got fame, exactly, whether it's a poetry, prose, fiction, drama, whichever maybe the part is there, what kind of factor that matters the most. Sometimes it may cover the lifespan of that particular author, or the entire period in which various authors or poets or the dramatists have played a kind of a great role. Right. Now, keeping this in mind, it is a matter of our understanding how do we deal with those subjects and how those subjects are in a way interlinked with each other. Now, while discussing the literary criticism, literary theories, we also have got developed with any particular pattern that would allow us to deal with exactly. So we try to check the background, then we try to check the various factors that have influenced the shaping of literary criticism, critical ideas and ideologies that got prevailed in those very particular period, right? Now, while discussing about literary criticism and literary theories, we have come across those various techniques. Similarly, when it comes to deal with literature very particularly, the historical background, the political, social and cultural elements, incidents and situational changes that have influenced the literature that got produced in this very particular period. This kind of study matters the most when it comes to study the very particular period. So far, I think you have discussed with the Augustan period, the various you know the things that got greatly influenced the period of Renaissance, the period of neoclassical ideas where order, wit, humor, exactly satire had got greater amount of importance. Now, when you look at this very particular period, I would say it is a matter of great concern to have this kind of understanding factor about dealing with those very particular periods and the prominent writers and the prominent poets, authors, and the dramatists that got greatly introduced and have tried, have contributed greatly in shaping, the proper identity of that very particular place. I mean, you look at, before we begin with this age of sensibility, talk about what is the, uh, no, what is the crux of this period, how this period has greatly contributed. Now, when you look at this very particular period, the age of sensibility, we have got two prominent periods that commence, the one that commence, that has commenced before this age of sensibility is the Augustan period, or which can be said as the age of Pope, where Alexander Pope, Dryden, and some prominent figures, Virgin and Homer, were there, and their greatest kind of classical ideas were highly referred. Order was considered. Reason had got greater amount of importance. A kind of a period where wit, exactly, and the right of, the metrical quality of the metrical use of poetry in making a kind of a quality poetry can be seen greatly used by Alexander Pope or some of his contributory factors that were there in this period very particularly. Now, keeping this very scene in the scene, as I said, this age of sensibility where we have got this period, it remains as a bridge between the neoclassical thoughts and then the immediately shift of reason over emotions, empathy, the sensibility, increasing sensibility towards the sentiments, exactly, could be seen, and this shift somehow is balanced by this age of sensibility, and so the prominent figures in this period matter the most, exactly. So, when we are going to deal with this age of sensibility in a very strict, in a very proper way, I think we're going to discuss on the background, the impactful factors which were there in this age of sensibility very particularly, and also in an interesting way we are going to cover up with few of the prominent factors, that is the prominent the key role played by many great authors in this very particular period, right? So it is much more of importance to have a look at those very interesting periods very particularly, right? And so let us shift with understanding more of about the age of sensibility otherwise, right? Now, when we talk about this very particularly, the age of sensibility, which this covers the period from 1750 exactly to 1798, that occupies the transition zone between the self-assured classicism of Pope and then the passionate romantic of Wordsworth. Exactly. So the level, when we talk about sensibility, we find it, in a way relating itself with the cultivated capacity to feel. It means to respond delicately and morally to the experiences of life and nature. Exactly. So in a way, the reason and emotions simultaneously can be seen taken parallelly, hand in hand, in this very particular period, which remains kind of like a significant factor to understand the importance of this very period when it comes to stand as a bridge between the neoclassicism and the romantic period, right? And so the work that got greatly produced in this period is also a kind of like an epoch, right? And so this remains very important to see. So we were going to see both continuity with a reaction against the intellectual values of the earlier 18th century particularly, and so this remains very much. Now, situating of this very period, the 18th century in England is often separated in two big movements particularly. The one is the neoclassical, or considered as the Augustan age, which governed by its writers such as John Dryden, then Alexander Pope, and Jonathan Swift, who propagated mostly order, exactly order, following the nature, following the order particularly. Then the reason and decorum. Decorum means the language, the style of language, the choice of language, the choice of words that got greatly introduced, and which were quite aligned with the subjectivity of the poetry or the literature that got produced, right? So this remains a significant factor to understand the difference between these two prominent events. The another is the Romantic age, which was governed by Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, exactly, who greatly experienced imagination, nature, and individuality, who explored the value of imagination, value of in nature and individuality, bringing more of importance to the individual factors that influenced the subject matter of Romantic period poetry. Really. Now, between these two, greatly epochs lies our subject, that is the interim of thought and the feeling, where moralists began to yield the dreamer and polished couplets slowly gave away to the personal lyrics particularly. So somehow the ideas that got greatly conceived in a neoclassical period and their excessive use somehow laid foundation for the Romantic thought, and this transition phase from neoclassical to Romantic period can be covered in this age of sensibility, can be seen happening in this age of sensibility, and thus this period of around 40 to 50 years matters the most period when it comes to understand the whole background of literary English literature and its historical identities or incidents that took place particularly, right? And moving forward, we have got the critic George Sainsbury, who greatly remarks that the latter half of this 18th century is one of those breathing spaces in which literature seems to pause, gather itself up, and then take a leap, exactly. So neoclassical period, then there is kind of a pause that can be seen with the age of sensibility, and then there is a great amount of leap, which the literature taking a leap in Wordsworth period or Coleridge's period, which is greatly governed by Romanticism, the difference between fancy and imagination, which was greatly spread, which was greatly discussed by S.P. Coleridge in his literature very particularly, right? And so this remains an interesting factor to have this very, and in a way interesting idea to understand how this, in a way this gap is been tried to bridge very particularly otherwise, because in a way when it comes to in a way comprehend this very interesting factor about the age of sensibility, which remains the bridging gap between the neoclassical period and Romantic period particularly. It is much more of importance to have how literature got its importance, right? So the image of a pause and leap precisely captures the characteristic of this very particular period, that is the age of sensibility, and it is not a void but a gathering of energy, the intellectual, the moral, and emotional, that will erupt in Romanticism. So somehow the imagination, emotion, fancy, the individuality or individual identity could be seen greatly conceived in here in this age of sensibility, which was trying to pull the reason order or also letting hand to the imagination, fancy, emotion, sentimental, that were greatly heightened in age of Romanticism very particularly. And moving ahead, we have got this the historical and social climate. Now looking at the 18th century, it's by the middle of this 18th century we can see Britain had changed in a great way, otherwise in a great depth otherwise. The industrial revolution, it was beginning to change the largely agrarian economy into an urban mechanical or mechanized one. Exactly. When it comes to talk about the change in period, right, it is much more important to have a look at the social and historical background of the very particular period. What social changes, what historical changes, what were the great incidents which covered the greater amount of time span and had a great amount of impact on society, it has to be taken into consideration. And so industrial revolution is one of the incidents that lasted for a long period of time, bringing kind of a greater amount of change, bringing a greater amount of change, not just in social strata, exactly, but the cultural and political and also the literary movements that got greatly shifted due to this industrialization, right? So, looking at the very prominent city, the hub of art, London particularly, was swelling into a metropolis of print shops, coffee houses and crowded, tenements, exactly. And so the rise of commercial middle class, can be seen greatly introduced with new patterns of reading and test, circulating libraries, periodicals, and the growth of novel all reflected this expanding readership particularly. Exactly, as the industrial revolution brought greater amount of luxury to the life, exactly, comfort was greatly produced, comfort was greatly prevailed in this very particular period, and so people turning out to be more of readers and developing their taste about literature could be seen greatly. And so as it was a demand of time and it was a demand of that particular period, so it affected the literature also that got greatly produced in this very period. So it remains an interesting factor to understand how this very one incident of the industrial revolution has greatly impacted not just the economical or in a way social strata, exactly the social elements of society, the elements of life, but in a way literature also can be seen greatly influenced with those factors, right? Moving ahead, we can see the political stand of Britain, which emerged from turbulence of civil war and the glorious revolution into a comparative stability under the constitution. And yet the abroad, we can see the winds of revolution were rising, and so we have seen again a remarkable incident in the history of this revolutionary factors, that is American War, actually, or we can see the American Revolution that took place in 1776, exactly, which constrained the empirical authority, and then we have got French Revolution, which got again inspired from American War of Independence, exactly led by Thomas Jefferson and other factors. And so we have seen again the prominent figures from French Revolution too, which shook the very foundations of European order. So due to these two very interesting events, you can see the ideas of liberty, equality, and the rights of man could be seen greatly discussed on the social forum, right? So somewhere these ideas too were, they also had got some kind of an importance in this very particular period. So the thought often stirred in Britain, nonetheless stirred the imagine of its writers, exactly. And as it was at a global level now, the gradually developing globalization also can be seen, and due to which the exchange of thoughts, ideas, and their influence on neighboring countries or across the globe can be seen. American War of Independence, some or the other way, influenced the French Revolution, and so its impact can be seen in various empirical orders where Britain had its control. Right, now, talking about this very interesting factor, it is much more of importance to have a look at this incident too, which in a way also has influenced the authors to change with their subject matter and coming up with the ideas and the notions that were prevailing in society, exactly, which were, the sign of intellectual property, right? So talking about this, the age of reason was beginning to doubt itself, in an intellectual way, and so the scientific optimism of Newton and Locke, which had encouraged faith, in human rationality, in a way encountered a growing sense that reason alone could not account for the depths of human emotions or the mysteries of moral life. And so we have got, as M.H. Abraham, a great critic, has greatly observed, the center of interest moves from the outer cosmos to the inner self, and so the polite essay and the heroic couplet no longer suffice, or they were not sufficient to express the complexities of individual feeling. Exactly. So the value to the fear, in a way, in this age of sensibility, the thought of individual identity, the emotions of an individual, the sensibility of an individual, the sentiments of an individual, exactly the subject matter, exactly. So the couplets, the forms, the order, the reason was not just anymore sufficient to express those ideas, as they were quite sufficient in neoclassical period, and so there emerged updated versions can be seen in romantic period particularly. So this historical background also is quite much more important to be taken into consideration. Moving ahead, what is then mean by sensibility? Exactly. Yes, in 18th century discourse, the term sensibility can be signified as a refined responsiveness of the heart and nerve. Exactly, a heightened capacity to sympathize with pleasure or pain. Exactly, where you are able to relate. Sensibility, exactly, where you are able to sense the happiness, Exactly, when somebody is happy, when you are able to associate with someone's happiness, you are able to relate with someone's happiness or someone's pain. Exactly, and this heart and nerve, exactly, which is responsive in a refined way, exactly, to those emotions, can be considered as the age of sensibility. Exactly, the medical writers of this period, they associate this term with the new science of the nerves. The moralists regard this sensibility as a sign of virtue. Exactly, and the novelist or the literary monks turn it into a hallmark of delicate characters. Exactly, to be a person of sensibility, was to possess quick and trembling awareness. Exactly, to weep at a scenes of suffering. Exactly, means to show you are sensible. Exactly, and to thrill at the beauties of nature, to feel intensely the moral life. Exactly, and so somehow these ideas also we can notice in the further literature that got produced in romantic period. Exactly, looking at the beauties of nature, giving much more importance to the valleys, rivers, mountains, sun, moon. Exactly, the natural elements could be seen in the writer from romantic period, that the work that they have introduced or they have produced so far. Exactly, and so it remains kind of like a significant factor to have a look at those very interesting factors. Now, yet this cult of feeling in a way was not more sentimentality. It expressed a serious philosophical shift also, the recognition that emotion is in a way made of moral knowledge. So we have got David Hume and Adam Smith, in their moral philosophies, discussing that sympathy is the foundation of ethics. Exactly, the ethics are aroused when we have a sympathization. So, to literature of the sensibility, therefore, can be seen seeking to educate the emotions and to cultivate the reader's moral imagination. Exactly, and that could be a scene kind of a creating kind of like a groundwork in a way otherwise. So we have got Rene Belleck, who has aptly called the period the bridge between the age of reason and the age of imagination. The writers which were there, we can find them regaining the moral earnestness of neoclassicism, but trying to join it with the emotional warmth, exactly, that would blossom fully in romanticism. So that's why this age is particularly called as the bridging one between the reason, order, and wit of neoclassical period to the emotion, imagination, individuality of romantic period. Somewhere this is how it is tried to be bridged between the two, and so this age of sensibility remains a in a way significant factor, right? Moving ahead, we have got this literary environment and the reading public. Okay, so again, talking about the in a way the clear background of this very particular period, you can see the mid 18th century, which witnessed the unprecedented expansion of literary, exactly, duty in the, as I said, industrialization, creating a lot of employment and giving a lot of awareness about literacy, education, getting educated, and bringing a lot of comfort to the people's lives. We can see, in a way, the increased literacy rate in European countries, particularly, and England, in a way, also had witnessed this scene in a great amount otherwise, right? So in a way, as it was available everywhere, printing also had become cheaper. So journals, as the Spectator, had already created a habit of reflective reading, and so the newly circulating libraries, which allowed in a way, so the quite unnoticed strata of life, that is women and the provincial leaders, access to books once reserved for the elite class. Okay, as earlier the literacy rate also had got very limited numbers, particularly, and its expansion and its expansion, particularly after the industrial revolution, can be witnessed in resulting into various achievements, particularly. And earlier, as the literature, as the number of literacy and the classics which were accessible only to the elite classes could be seen accessible to the provincial and women also, in a way. And so their easy accessibility in a way can be seen developed with the public reading, exactly, public accessing to the books, you know and so as a result literature became more domestic, intimate, and moral. So the heroic couplet which was there, it gave away to the blank verse mediation, and satire yielded to the sentimental tale. Exactly. So the novel of sentiments, which was exemplified by Richard Stearns, Pamela and Stearns' sentimental journey, it emerged alongside the graveyard poem and the meditative ode. So in these forms, we can see author addressing not the intellectual but the heart. Exactly. So tears, sympathy, benevolence, exactly, and moral reflection can be seen replaced with witty epigram and the classical allusion. So, in a way, we can see the literary forms and the environment of literary reading public can be seen greatly influenced. Now, we can see, looking at the period, the spirit of transition, to understand the age of sensibility as a true transitional era, we have to know how it both inherits and this is the Augustan tradition. Certain elements from the Augustan traditions could be seen greatly followed and observed, and also certain elements strictly avoided. And so a kind of a balance is tried to be maintained over here, right? So from Augustine, they have inherited a concern for moral order. Exactly, a moral order has to be there, and this age of sensibility, it's a concern. It's a concern can be greatly noticed with those very interesting writings by the prominent figures of this very particular period. Then clarity of expression and respect for reasoned judgment. So these are the prominent elements which were inherited from the Augustan tradition. Yet it resisted Augustan tradition such as a rationalism by asserting that truth is not merely logical but emotional and intuitive. Right? So your emotions, your intelligence also are the greatest significant factors which remain in a way otherwise interesting to understand that exactly there is not just only a logical order or reason required to achieve the truth. Particularly, it's a it's another side through emotions and intuitions can be also achieved very particularly. We also can notice, where we can see Pope, writing to know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The poets of sensibility turn inward, not to submit to reason, but to explore the heart mystery. What your heart tells exactly, what are the emotions that is close to your hearts, they have to be explored, they have to be given a way out, and so they have to be put forth in such a way, and this style particularly can be seen greatly getting developed this very particular period otherwise. Exactly. So it's also quite interesting this stylistic shift. Otherwise, in a place of heroic couplets, we begin to hear the softer cadence of blank verse, and the lyrical rhythm that will become quite romantic or quite popular in romantic period. And also, imaginary turning from city to the countryside, from polished salons to the solitary churchyards, and from satire to reflection. Right, and thus it is a matter of great significance otherwise to have this very interesting look otherwise, right, and so it is a matter of great concern to be taken into consideration otherwise to have a look at this very interesting factor, how we can see the shift from the neoclassical fascinated factors to the romantic fascinated factors. Exactly, what was fascinating in romantic period is not there in neoclassical period, and so this shift can be noticed in a very interesting way with this period. Exactly, and so David Deitch is a very famous critic who notes in a way that the emphasis moves from public statement to private experiences. Exactly, and so city, exactly, a focus of city turning into countryside, and from polished saloons to solitary churchyards could be greatly noticed otherwise, right? So it is of a much more important to have a look at this interesting factor. Exactly. So in a way, it is much more of an importance to have a look at this interesting factor about how the paradigm shift can be noticed between romantic neoclassical period to the uh, in a way uh, from romantic period, from neoclassical period to romantic period otherwise, right. Now intellectual movements and influencing that influence the period, let us come across various intellectual movements that have influenced the shaping of this very particular period, ideologies, thought processes, and various literary genres that got greatly published and the subject matter particularly, right. Several intellectual currents fed this transformation. The one is moral sense philosophy. Philosophers such as Shaftesbury, Hudson, and Hume propose that humans possess an innate moral sense, a natural sympathy guiding ethical behavior, which is inherent in human, can be seen greatly propagated by these philosophers. And so, this theory, in a way, encouraged the writers to trust emotional intuitions rather than abstract reason. Exactly. So, a process of gaining the truth through reason, exactly, and a lot of mobility could be greatly noticed with this period. But in case of understanding this very interesting factor, somewhere the idea of gaining the truth or explaining the truth through emotions and intuitions can be greatly propagated in romantic period. Exactly. So we find literature beginning to portray the virtue of feeling rather than virtue of logic. You know, so further movement we have is empiricism and the cult of experience. Lockean empiricism had emphasized experience, as the source of knowledge. By mid-century, experience came to include emotional and sensory experience. So poetry can be seen seeking to compare immediately of perception. Exactly. So the rustle of leaves, the stillness of twilight, the solitude of graveyard could be seen in a way capturing the immediacy of perception, how you perceive things, how your perception, your sensory organs allow you to take things, and so it allows you to explore the emotions that are close to your hearts. The picturesque and sublime, so the aesthetic theoretism also can be seen in a way, greatly noticed over here, in a way, and so we can see in a way, their reflections otherwise could be seen with this romantic period very particularly. Now the aesthetic stability or sensibility could be noticed in a way otherwise, which is of a much more important, right? So what we notice in picturesque and sublime movement, the aesthetic theory underwent change through writings of Edmund Burke and others. So his a philosophical inquiry into origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful can be seen differentiating between the beautiful, which is gentle and harmonious, and the sublime, which is awe-inspiring, vast, and even terrifying. So this new sensibility to emotional aesthetics profoundly, influenced the poets such as Gray, and later we can see its impact on Wordsworth too. Exactly. So the movement of picturesque and sublime also seen can be influencing some prominent figures of the period in religious and moral revival. The uh, the evangelic movement and the Methodism, which was led by John Wesley and George Whitefield, stressed the personal emotion in religion, conversion through heartfelt experiences rather than ritual observance. Exactly, until and unless it is appealing to your heart, you literally feel it, you literally experience it, you have got those assimilating emotions with those religious thoughts. There is no point of convergence rather than just merely following observance of ritual observance where you find no kind of an assimilation through heart. So such a currents in a way contributed to the emotional tone of literature. Exactly. And now the three prominent modes. Now let us go and try to understand the literary sensibility in practice, particularly how it was defined particularly. Now to examine how this sensibility manifests in literary practice, it is much more important to understand the three dominant modes that appear: the meditative poem, the sentimental novel, and the periodical essay and moral reflection. Exactly. Now the meditative poem, which is quite reflective, which is quite moral, often set in nature or the churchyard. The next one we have is the sentimental novel, which is depicting virtuous suffering and moral sympathy. And then lastly, we have is the periodical essay and the moral reflections, which try to balance the intellectual with feelings. So all these three forms, particularly focus at moral cultivation through emotion. Exactly. And so literature becomes kind of a mirror, the mirror of ethical sensibility, and rather than a display of wit. So now considering Thomas Gray's quiet lines in the elegy written in country churchyard, the path of a glory laid but to the grave. Exactly. This words, these lines are dignified, yet personal, moral, yet compassionate, far from the satiric glitter of Pope. So it speaks not the reason but the heart's sense of human equality. And similarly, we have Oliver Goldsmith and his work, The Deserted Village, which mourns the loss of rural simplicity. In a way, so the emotional appealing, okay, which says ill fears the land of hastening ill spray, where wealth accumulates and men decay, where he unites the social criticism with moral sympathy. Exactly, a new blend characteristic of sensibility. This could be noticed with this period. Then we have got the chronological boundaries and the problem of naming it. Now, this period's boundaries, though conventionally fixed at 1750 to 1798, are fluid. Its roots stretch back to the early sentimentalism of the 1730s and the reach forward to the Romantic Manifesto of around 1798, the publication of lyrical ballads and the Wordsworth and Coleridge particularly. Now, indeed, many historians describe it as the pre-romantic age. It is definitely considered as the age of sensibility. Yet, the pre-romantic can be misleading, for it implies mere preparation rather than intrinsic worth. So, in truth, the age of sensibility possesses distinctive identities. As Northrop Fryer reminds us, the transitional periods that are not simply bridges but climates of their own. So, they house contradictions, experimentations, and subtle shifts of, in a way, perceptions that cannot be subsumed exactly under the label before or after, particularly, right? So, not after Romanticism or not after a neoclassical period or not before Romanticism, such a kind of labelizations even wouldn't work in a way. So this remains kind of like an interesting factor, to be taken into consideration otherwise, right? So it is much more of importance to have a look at those very periods otherwise, right? So moving forward, let us try to understand the key figures who foreshadowed. Exactly, there are individual writers in the later sections, and let us they are principal voices whose works embody this sensibility particularly. And in the further period, we are going to discuss about them in a detailed way. But these are the in a way prominent figures who, in a different way, have helped to redirect the English letters from wit to feeling and from in a way reason to sensibility. Samuel Johnson is there, who is also considered a moralist and critic, and his human sympathy tempers is a neoclassical discipline otherwise. Exactly, he is not a completely full passion neoclassical, but somehow we also find him in a balanced way, not being way too romantic, not being way too neoclassical, right? So further we have with Oliver Goldsmith, who is also a poet, novelist, and dramatist, and he weaves simplicity and moral tenderness together. So his writing remains, in a way, influential factor in case of understanding the further part, right? And moving ahead, we have with us is Thomas Gray, whose meditative lyricism fuses the reflection and melancholy together. We have got James Thompson, again another important figure, who is earlier yet prophetic in his celebration of nature. Then we have got William Collins, exactly again, whose odes reveal musical passions particularly. And we have got Thomas Watton and Thomas Percy, who revived interest in medieval literature and the popular ballad. Now, each of those in different ways help to redirect English letters, as I said earlier, from wit to feeling and from reason to sensibility. And now, to conclude the introduction, to summarize this opening section, the age of sensibility, in a way, stands to the juncture of two mental worlds: the rational and the emotional, the classical and the romantic otherwise. This inherits the moral earnestness of the age of sensibility, in a way inherits the earnestness, the moral earnestness of neoclassical period, and but it wears the clothes, it in a way the new garments of, in a way, where there is a value to the sentiments, there is a value to sympathy and the subjective reflection. So its literature is both mirror and lamp. A mirror reflecting the moral complexities of 18th century life, and a lamp which projects the inward light upon human emotion. Thus, it remains a significant factor to understand the difference between this age of sensibility, particularly compared to the other ages. So, as we proceed to examine the major writers of this era, the next segment, we shall see how each negotiates this tension between the intellect and feeling, and how together they prepare a way for the romantic revolution of the imagination, right? And before we move with major writers and the literary features of this age of sensibility, I think it is much more important to have a look at what we have been discussing so far. So this was the introductory part for the age of sensibility. Exactly, we have seen what is the difference between the age of sensibility. What were the prominent figures? Exactly, it is neither the end of neoclassical period or not just the immediate beginning of romantic period. This age of sensibility can be defined as the age of sensibility because somewhere in a way, as initially we discussed, it tried to understand and explore the emotions that are close to the heart. Exactly, it tried to balance between reason and feeling. It tried to balance between logic and emotions, and giving away out to imagination, individual identities, rather than just a mere public statement. So in a way, this age remains kind of like a significant factor to comprehend about how it bridges the gap between the romantic period and neoclassical period. The excessive uh, prevailing factors of neoclassical periods such as order, reason, wit, humor could be seen greatly replaced by sentiment, sensibility, emotions, imagination, individual identities, and natural. So cities replaced by countries, exactly. The elite class, in a way, the style, the decorum can be seen replaced with the simplification of language, use of simple language. So all those gaps and these things can be seen greatly, in a way bridged by those edges. And before, in a way, we move to, in a way, to the uh, age of sensibility and understanding the major characters of this very particular period. Let us take a break for 5 minutes and come back with understanding the contribution of major factors, the major contributors of this literature, the major contributors of the literature in this very particular period. Fine. So before we move, let us take a break for towards the new sensibility. Dr. Samuel Johnson, who is from 1709 to 784, considering the last person from the neoclassical period completely, but not as a completely Augustine period or neoclassical period. Exactly, he is in a many ways the last great representative of neoclassical discipline. Yet, in his moral insight and sympathetic depth, he anticipates romantic humanism. Otherwise, how we will be exploring it through our discussion about his writings. His prose, as we encounter it, the Rambler, the Idler, and the lives of the poets, reflects the age's moral seriousness. Exactly. So, understanding and remembering these titles is also one of the important factors to realize his people, because he retains the classical virtues of clarity and order, but his essays often reveal the profound compassion of for human suffering otherwise. And so, in a way, being a neoclassical and idealistic critic, we also find him inclining towards the ideas that are in a way of a romantic moment. So in Ramler, number 16, for example, he writes that the business of a poet is to examine and not the individual but the species. Exactly. And this statement reveals his Protestant rationalism. Yet when he turns to depict the species, he does not so. Exactly. He does it so with a penetrating sense of frailty and empathy, definitely. So his moral imagination shows his own kind of sensibility. So consider his essay on the miseries of old age, or reflections on the fleeting nature of happiness, particularly. Behind the learned diction lies a man acutely conscious of emotional vulnerability. Now, as a critic, Walter Jackson Bates notes Johnson's virtue lies not in detachment from feeling, but in his perpetual struggle with it. Exactly, is a perpetual struggle with feeling, emotion is a kind of a matter of greater significance, so that remains in a way, making him more inclining towards, or in a way balancing between neoclassical and in a way the romantic imagination or emotion. Exactly, so his melancholy, his fear of madness, and his Christian stoicism endow his moralism with human death. Exactly, uh, Johnson wrestles uh, it exemplifies the moral tale of reflection. In this philosophical romance, Prince Rascals leaves the happy valley to search for lasting happiness, only to learn that no human condition is exempt from discontent. Exactly. So, illness, sadness is everywhere there, and somehow is describing this kind of a character through the works. Exactly. Here we find him that reason conducts the inquiry, but feeling provides the succor, a way to have a comfort. Exactly. So feeling, exactly, reason is something that have allowed him to go out, exactly, and to explore and inquire about it. But in a way, the feelings to relate with all the other sufferings and miseries and happiness around has allowed him to go through a path. So this novel ends without triumph or despair, suggesting a moral wisdom grounded in a sympathy. Exactly. And thus, in Restless, as in the essays, his compassion or the common human predicament aligns him with the age of sensibility. Exactly. So, though he has come up with his essays more of intellectual and highly appealing, exactly, his compassion for the common human predicament allows him to sit in a row with the thought process of the age of sensibility. Moreover, in his Lives of Poets, which is kind of a prominent work in 1979, covers the span of 1779 to 1801. The criticism, though it is quite rational, is deeply human. Actually. So his a portrait of Milton, his a defense of Shakespeare's human variety, his evolution of Gray's elegy. All this reveal a critic moved by moral feeling as well as intellectual balance. Exactly. So somebody is like that who is moved by moral feeling but also intellectual balance. So Johnson bridges the rational and emotional. His humanity tempers his classicism, as Welleck remarks, a prominent critic, that in Johnson, sense and sensibility are reconciled. Exactly. And so again he remains kind of like a bridging factor of extreme neoclassic and extreme romanticism otherwise, right? The second prominent figure we have with us is Oliver Goldsmith. Okay. If Johnson represents the intellectual of the age, Oliver Goldsmith, who covers from 1728 to 1774, in a way represents its heart, exactly, the intellect of age, exactly. If Samuel Johnson is an identity of the intellectual identity of age of sensibility, the heart of this age of sensibility can be considered Oliver Goldsmith. He is a He's a poet, novelist, dramatist, essayist. Exactly, he has written so many essays, very famous essays otherwise. He was the very embodiment of 18th century versatility. Yet beneath his graceful style lies profound sympathy for the humble and the distant. In a way, so his emotional attachment with those subject matters of the society is also quite natural. Now, in his The Deserted Village is one of the quite essential poems, exactly quintessential poems of sensibility, which mourns the decline of rural virtues and the corruption brought by wealth and enclosure. So the famous lines, ill fears the land, his hastings ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. Exactly, where wealth has become more and the value of wealth has increased over the value of ethics, morals of a man, which is overpowered otherwise. Exactly. So he says, where wealth is accumulated and men are decaying, remaining as one of the prominent lines. Exactly, which says, ill fares the land, to hastening is prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay, where he expresses not only social criticism but also moral critique. His voice is that of a compassionate observer, where he laments on the moral loss accompanying the economic progress. Exactly. So when he talks about the economic progress, we find him criticizing at what cost we are criticizing, at what cost we are going to this economic progress very particularly. Exactly. At what cost we are making this economic progress. Exactly. Right. So we have to have this very the clear identification, no, right? So this remains in a way significant factor to understand that the prominence, right? So critics George Sainsbury calls William Goldsmith the poet of moral sweetness. His poetry and prose demonstrate a belief that virtue resides not in a grandeur but in simplicity. Exactly. So your virtue matters the most. Exactly, and it is not there with something grander, something big, something heavy, something glorifying, but more of in a simplicity. So this remains interesting to understand, right? And so in his novel the Vicar of Wakefield, we find him presenting the primors of family as a symbol of domestic virtue, enduring adversity through patience, benevolence, and faith. Exactly. So he portrays a family, though, which comes, when he talks about the Vicar of Wakefield, exactly, who values more of moral. Exactly, he is not ready to be corrupt. He is not ready. So he comes across very financial problems, social problems, exactly poverty. Though all those adversities are there, we find him yet prioritizing the value, ethics, morals in a such a way, right? And so we find him, patience, benevolence, and faith. So the character that he has portrayed in his Vicar of Wakefield remains again a significant factor, right? So the novel's tears and reconciliations may appear sentimental, but they arise from a moral ideal of human goodness rooted in feeling. So the human goodness is rooted in feeling, exactly, and that can be portrayed, exactly, arising from the moral ideal, exactly. So can be noticed in his portraying characters and themes through the writing. So he remains that instruct the heart as much as the mind. And so his essay, A City of Night Peace, and his drama, She Stoops to Conquer, reveals the human laughter. Exactly. Through his satire, we find, which is quite gentle and directed not at a vice with bitterness, but a folly with indulgence of humor. Exactly, indulgent humor. So he thus tries to frame the sentimental moralist. Exactly, he comprises, he's made up of a sentimental moralist, particularly who believes in a sympathy and the true nature of civilization. Sympathy, labelizing as the true measure of civilization, right? Further to him, we have Thomas Gray, the elegiac voice, exactly the elegiac voice of this age, the age of sensibility, uh, in a particular sense otherwise, who remains again one of the in a way important factor of this very age. The most celebrated poet of mid-century sensibility is undoubtedly Thomas Gray, who covers the span of 1716 to 1771. Exactly. So, reticent, scholarly, and refined, he produced a small body of poetry that profoundly influenced English taste. His elegy written in country churchyard, stands as the emblem of the age. Composed in quatrains of balanced rhythm, the poem contemplates the humble dead of a rural churchyard. Exactly, it's an elegy, which is quite famous, written in a country churchyard. Right? It combines the classical virtues of restraint and order with the emotional depth of compassion. And so he writes what he writes: the boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth ever gave, await alike the inevitable hour, the path of glory laid but to the grave. These lines exemplify the fusion of moral reflection and tender sympathy, the characteristics of this age, the age of sensibility, exactly, moral sensibility particularly. His way, we find him elevating the common life by investigating it with dignity, and so he moves away from the heroic subjects of earlier poetry to the quiet universality of human mortality. Right? And so, in his Ode on the Spring, Ode on a Distant Prospect of Eton College, and The Bard, we perceive the awakening of romantic sensibility. Exactly, a delight in nature, a nostalgic for childhood innocence, a fascination with the past, and a musical lyricism unprecedented in English verse since Milton. As we find those qualities with romantic period can be found earlier with the writing of Thomas Gray, right? And so in the Bard, the voice of the Welsh poet becomes a prophetic symbol of the poet as a national conscience, a national, exactly, it is a notion that Wordsworth and Shelley should later expand. So, if the critic A.C. Bradley, who described Gray's poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility before Wordsworth had defined it. Exactly. Before Wordsworth defined it, we can see its practicality in Gray's poetry, which was criticized by A.C. Bradley. Indeed, his meditative melancholy anticipates the romantic inwardness that will soon dominate the English poetry. And after Thomas Gray, exactly, we have got the prominent figure Thomas James Thomson and the Poetics of Nature. Now, before Gray, James Thomson had already inaugurated a new mode of natural description in his long poem, The Seasons. Exactly. His blank verse mediations on spring, summer, autumn, and winter mark a decisive departure from artificial pastels of earlier poetry. And so he observes nature, not as a classical ornament, but as a living, dynamic presence. And so the lines that goes, these as they change, Almighty Father, these are but the varied God. These lines, they reveal quasi-religious pantheism and prefigures Wordsworth's spiritual sense of nature. Wordsworth's style of looking at nature with great spirituality, its already inheritance can be seen with James Thomson particularly, right? And so Thomson's sensibility is visual and emotional. He perceives in nature both beauty and moral instruction. So his influence extended to later poets like William Cowper, Collins, and even to landscape patients of the picturesque school. Again, one of the major movements that got flourished in this age that we have already seen about. Thomason also wrote Rule Britannia, Rule Britannia, a patriotic ode celebrating liberty and reminding us that the age's emotionalism coexisted with political and moral fervor. Thus, in Thomson, we witness the earliest flowering of that poetics of nature, which is the romantics would inherit for sure. And for him, after that, we have got again one of the prominent figure of this period, the age of sensibility, is that William Collins, the lyric of invention. Contemporary with Gray, William Collins, which covers the period of 1721 to 1759, whose odes exemplify the lyrical intensity of sensibility. And so, in the poems such as Ode to Evening, Ode to Simplicity, and The Passions, he turns poetry inward, seeking to give the moments of emotion itself. Now, in Ode to Evening, he addresses the personified uh, in Ode to Evening, we find him addressing the evening in a musical cadence that anticipates Keats, right, which is quite closer to him. Now, air is hushed, save where the weak-eyed bat with short, still shriek fits by an leathern wing. Exactly, the sound and imaginary here merge into tranquil melody. So the poem conveys serenity through the rhythm rather than statement, a new aesthetic of feeling. So his ode on the poetical character proclaims imagination as divine gift, which foreshadows the romantic theory. And so the critics such as H.A. Taine considered Collins the first English poet who felt purely through music. So his use of irregular Pindaric odes, the musical phrasing, and emotional abstractions, they distinguish him as a precursor to the Romantic lyric. The Romantic lyric, which are quite famous for their musical attributions and rhythmic qualities, in a way, their lyrical styles, their precursors can be noted in the writings of William Collins, right? And so, while his life ended in melancholy, his work, in a way, radiates, shines that delicate, nervous sensibility that the age has prized. And moving forward again, the Greybird School, exactly, parallel to Gray and Collins, ran a group of poets often termed the Greybird School, and the group comprises Robert Blair, Edward Young, Thomas Parnell, and others. And their poems, such as the Young's, no, Thomas Edward Young's The Night Thoughts, and Robert Blair's The Grave, mediate on death, decay, and immortality. Exactly. So the virtue is there, moral is there, but in a way, emotions are also there, and their combination can be greatly seen. And so these figures remain very important people to have a look at them in case of comprehending the appearance of questions based on those contents for next examination. At a first glance, these works appear gloomy, but their true impulse is moral and emotional. So they invite reflections of human finitude and divine justice. Now, this fascination with mortality reflects the religious and sentimental mood of the mid-century, an awareness of life's fragility, intensified by urbanization and social change. So the graveyard poets introduced into English verse a tone of introspection and melancholy that would profoundly influence the later writers. So their imagery, in a way, their imagery of moonlit churchyards and the silent tombs provided the symbolic landscape of sensibility otherwise. And so they remain very otherwise important factors because they could be seen their you know in a way, their understanding and imagination could be seen greatly influenced with those of the further figures, right? And so the next figure we have with us is Thomas Warton and the medieval revival. While some poets turn to emotions, others looked backward to the Middle Ages for imaginative renewal. And so chief among them was Thomas Warton, who spans from 1728 to 1790. a historian of English poetry and advocate of Gothic romance. Okay, the history of English poetry from 1774 to 81 traces the continuity of English literature from Chaucer to his own day, where he revives interest in medieval narrative, balladry, and superstitions. His poem, "The Pleasure of Melancholy," exemplifies the that cultivated sadness beloved of the century, exactly as it was kind of one of the attributes of Age of Sensibility. By turning to the Gothic past, we find Warton helping prepare Romanticism's fascination with ruins, legends, and the supernaturals. So his influence is inseparable from that of Thomas Percy, whose relics of ancient English poetry collected old ballads and, in a way, the folk songs, giving new importance to the native traditions, particularly. As a historian, Ernest Baker remarks that Percy's relics there could have been no Wordsworthian ballad, and so Wordsworth's ballads could be seen influenced by those of the Percy's writings. So, thus, antiquarian curiosity of the Age of Sensibility sowed seeds of the Romantic returns. Now, the sentimental novel. Moving ahead, while poetry cultivated emotional refinement, prose fiction of the period pursued the ideal through narrative. The sentimental, the same ideal through the narratives we can see can be spread with the novel. So, the sentimental novel emerged as a dominant form, trying to seek to educate feeling and moral sympathy. So, we have got Samuel Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa, which established the moral psychological novel, which are the established psychological moral novel. In these epistolary works, virtue is tested through suffering, and readers are invited to weep with the heroine. And so is the clear assimilation of the readers and the characters of the theme. So Richardson's influence persisted into the later sentimental fiction of this Sterne and Magazine. Now, Laurence Sterne's A Sentimental Journey Through France and Italy is perhaps purest expressions of sensibility in prose. Its narrator, Yorick, experiences the moral elevation through moments of emotional contact. No, a tear shed for a dead donkey, a handshake with a humble peasant, kind of examples. Stern, deliberately fragments narrative to mimic the fluctuations of feelings. As a critic, Ian Watt observed Stern made the heart an organ of moral knowledge. So here, the cultivation of sympathy becomes both aesthetic and ethical in a way, and so it is much more of importance to have a look at those prominent figures to who played kind of. Now we are covering with the narrative techniques and the novels. Henry Mancini's The Man of Feelings continues this cult of tenderness. Its a hero, Harley, moves through a world of distress, shedding tears of pity that affirm his virtue. Now, the modern readers may find such sentimentality excessive, yet for the 18th century audience, it represented moral refinement. Okay, through these novels, the Age of Sensibility articulated a new ideal of sympathetic virtue, later transformed by romantic introspection, right? And now we have got again one of the prominent figure, William Cowper, the domestic and religious sensibility. Toward the later part of the century, William Cowper, who covers from 1731 to 1800, becomes the chief poetic voice. His The Task, published in 1785, and hymns such as Good Moves in a Mysterious Way, reflect a quite domestic and profoundly Christian sensibility. His poetry delights in the familiar landscape of the English countryside, the hearth, the garden, the walk, the moral mediation, and so forth. So he writes, God made the country and man made the town, exactly making a difference and making more inclining towards the romantic thought process. Here is a both moral assertion and emotional repose. His PT is introspective, his language is simple and anticipating Wordsworth's language of real men in a way. So, critic Stafford Brook called him the first poet of the inner life. He is a combination of nature, home, and religious reflection, epitomizes or sets an example of the sentimental inwardness of closing the 18th century, particularly. Now, the aesthetic development, no, especially the sublime, the beautiful, and the picturesque. Parallel to literary evolution, aesthetic theory during this period underwent a decisive transformation. Edmund Burke's philosophical inquiry into origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful established an emotional psychological of the emotional psychology of art. He argued that beautiful elicits, love, harmony, and smoothness, while the sublime in a way inspires awe through vastness and obscurity. Now, these categories encouraged poets to seek not reason proportion but emotional effect, and hence the growing interest in storms, mountains, ruins, and twilight scenes could be noticed. The picturesque, theorized by William Gilpin, these picturesques valued regularity and variety, bridging art and nature. Painters and poets alike pursued landscapes that were emotionally suggestive rather than geometrically perfect. So these aesthetic theories fed directly into romantic practice. They train readers to respond to nature with feeling and not geometry. Now, talking about the themes and characteristics summarized. Now, let us know the consolidate the literary features and that define the age of sensibility. Emphasis on emotions and sympathy. Now, feeling became a moral guide. Nature as a moral and spiritual perseverance. Nature as a spiritual and moral perseverance. The transition from decorative to reflective landscape could be noticed. Melancholy and mortality. The elegiac tone, awareness of impermanence, the cult of the simple and the ritual. Exactly. The valorization of village life, pastoral innocence. So the cult of the simple and rural. Uh, then we are going through the various features, particularly the interest in the past and primitive, the medievalism, ballad revival, moral didacticism tempered by the feeling, the fusion of the ethics and emotions, a new poetic language moving from formality toward the natural rhythm and the diction, which further led to what Wordsworth had claimed in his lyrical ballads about this. Uh, exactly. So each of these tendencies mark, you know, uh, a step away from the rigid rationalism of neoclassicism towards the expressive freedom of romanticism. Moving further, the transition evident in a style, how style also got greatly changed. Formally, we observed several stylistic shifts. There is from heroic couplet to blank verse and lyrical ode. Poets sought flexibility and natural cadence. From public to private tone, the oratorial stance else to personal confessions, particularly from satire to sentiments, and from softness to sympathy. Laughter becomes moral reflection, and from artificial personae to authentic voice. The poet speaks as individual rather than the moral arbiter, right? So these stylistic evolutions embody the movement, the age of sensibility, from external order to internal sensibility. Exactly, giving much more, in a way, importance to those things. And so uh, the interrelative among the writers where it is useful to see the writers not as isolated figures but as an interconnected networks. Johnson and Goldsmith represent ethical core. Gray and Collins embody the lyrical and reflective impulse. Barton and Percy revive historical imagination. Sterne and Mackenzie develop sentimental psychology. Cooper synthesizes all into domestic piety. So together they construct a composite image of sensibility that unites moral earnestness with emotional delicacy. And moving to further part of this critical perspective, exactly, then the moral vision of age and so forth and so much, right? Yes, yes. Before we move to this, we are about to end with the second phase of this age of sensibility. We have divided into this three-part: introduction, then the major works and themes that got introduced, and then the critical approaches, right? So let us conclude our today's session on this note, where we have left the talking about the age of sensibility in half. Exactly, it's a further part we are going to discuss in our upcoming lecture series for sure. Uh, Till then, we'll go on revising what we have discussed so far in age of sensibility and this age of reason. Fine, right? Now we will commence with our this thought on critical perspective. Then in our tomorrow session, we'll talk about the moral vision of the age, and then the toward romanticism, and finally we'll begin with the critical analysis and the transition of romanticism. Exactly, we'll be discussing this third part, which again covers a major portion, you know, in a way, in our upcoming sessions. Fine, and after that we'll begin with romanticism as one of the prominent period in history of literary criticism. Right, right. So let's conclude today over here, and with adieu on this very interesting